It's a great, great pleasure to introduce our next guest. We are very, very delighted that the legendary artist David Goldblatt has agreed to join us in the Memory Marathon today. David's work has been fundamental and is fundamental in shaping our visual memory of South African society. He was born in Radfontein, South Africa in 1930 and became a full-time photographer in 1963. His entire photographic life has been divided between parallel realities. On the one hand, the professional work he did for magazines, for corporation, and then the personal work for which he's so well known all over the world. This work includes many essays on different aspects of South African society, and he very often is connected to memory, which we're going to discuss today. David Goldblatt lives in Johannesburg. A very, very warm welcome to David. David, thanks again for joining us. I just wanted to begin with the beginning and wanted to ask you, because you actually started, you didn't start as a photographer, you started as an economist. And you told me when we visited your studio in Johannesburg that economics is the science of human action. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about this idea of the science of human action and how you then came from economics into photography.
Well, it's simply a basic observation that was made clear by the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, that we do everything conscious out of sense of values. And our human action is dictated by the values that we select. And to me, photography, or the kind of photography that I do, is very largely almost entirely concerned with human values. What are our values? How did we come to them? And in particular, how we express them.
And talking about human values, maybe we can begin with looking at the pictures, because I think one of the first pictures you brought is a photograph of the Old Mill Foundations from August 1966. I must say that it's much better for you to watch it on the screen on the side. So if you could have those screens moved a little bit forward, that would be wonderful on both sides, so that you can see them better. Yeah, David, so the Old Mills Foundation from '66 is a very poignant image, and it's a whole series of mills. And I kind of remember at a certain point in the early 90s, I visited Berl and Hiller Becher in Düsseldorf, and they were saying there are all these things which disappear. And you know, as photographers, one can actually somehow keep them for the memory. So I was wondering if you can tell us about this photograph of the old mill and maybe this whole series of mills, which obviously now in big parts have disappeared.
Yeah, this photograph comes from the dying mines of the Witwatersrand, where I was brought up. And the foundations and the tailings wheel that you see here and the mine dump are very much a part of the world that I grew up in. And coming to the realization that this world was passing and that these places would soon disappear, I set out in the 1960s to photograph some of them. And if we're talking about memory and what it means, these places were particularly poignant and significant to me.
And it's obviously also got to do with work. It's like a monument somehow to work.
Well, I think that photography in its very nature almost monumentalizes things as we go along. And I suppose in a sense, I was taking these photographs of the dying mines of the Witwatersrand in order to, in some modest way, monumentalize material and structures, and in particular structures, because they embody so much in values that were so deeply embedded with the labor of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, of men, who came from all over Africa to make these things. Every grain of sand in the mine dumps of the Witwatersrand came off the shovel of a man underground.
And maybe we can have the second image now, which is another image from 1966, which actually shows two-time office clerks and a miner, so it's still connected to the series of the miner. It's very interesting, I think, because we had Richard's and Lynette's presentation, which showed us many different constellations in different photographs of people, and here we somehow remain unsure of the dynamic between these three people. Can you tell us?
Yeah. The time office clerks were the cream, if you like, of the African working force on the mines. These were clerks, and this was the highest echelon to which African men could then aspire. They kept the records of the working life of every man on the mine. I had actually taken another photograph of three of these men when this miner walked into the room. And I then obviously took this photograph. It embodies, if you like, the different structures, the hierarchy of mines, because the man in the middle, the miner, is in rags, and the other men are very well attired.
Got a third image, which still is connected to the mining series. It's called Spanner Man at the end of the shift.
No, that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the shaft sinking.
Oh, we have the shaft sinking first, but that's from 69 then,
yes,
yeah?
Yes,
but it's also a mining series.
Yes, this is also mining. By the nature of the world that I grew up in, I was very, very much interested in mining, in particular in gold mining. And the sinking of a shaft is one of the most dangerous peacetime occupations, I think, that men can do. They sink a hole vertically into the ground, maybe 6, 8, 9, 10,000 feet. It's a very audacious and dangerous and difficult thing to do, to go down into the solid rock. And I was very privileged and fortunate to spend some time with men underground and photographed the whole process. To me, one of the most meaningful things that I've ever done.
And he continues with the next image, which is the Spanner Man at the end of the shift, I think.
Yeah.
Western Deep Levels Gold Mine, Carterville, 1970s. Also, actually, part of this whole tradition of images of labor, of workers leaving the factory and leaving the site of production. Can you tell us more?
Yeah. This man had just come off shift, and he was doing one of the ancillary jobs to the men who actually drill at the rock face to drill holes into the rock into which explosives are charged. You've probably seen images recently of rock drill miners in the platinum mines in South Africa on strike, and the terrible incident in which some 42 of them were shot dead. They're connected very closely with this man here. It's terribly hard work, and not surprisingly, there have been strikes on the mines by the men in these vocations.
And obviously that will be something we discuss later in the conversation, when you said earlier this morning at breakfast that many of these things also sort of post-apartheid obviously continue. But before that, I wanted to ask you, because when I saw this for the first time, I was also thinking of the workers leaving the Lumière factory in Lyon of 1895, which is one of the first Lumière brothers film. And the poet Czesław Miłosz, whom we visited in Krakow, he was too old to travel. He was almost 100 years old at that time, but he was very involved in these conversations about the early marathons. And he said that no matter what is the practitioner, if a poet or a novelist or an architect or a scientist or a photographer or a painter, anybody who sort of worked in the 20th century somehow was affected by the moving image, by cinema. And I was wondering, as we look here at your photographs, if that's true for you, if there was any kind of, and if you've ever thought about working with moving image?
To me, the moving image is something that I enjoy greatly. I love watching good film, but frankly, I don't lust after being a cinematographer. It's difficult enough being a stills photographer. I've heard that still photographers make good cinematographers, but I've not heard of a good cinematographer becoming a good stills photographer. Because I think that the problem in stills photography is somehow to contain within one image, and it's a very attenuated medium, photography. It's not like paint, which has all the richness and the splendor, if you like, of a whole range of colors and textures and so on. The photograph, and in particular the black and white photograph, is a very attenuated thing, a little square of gray paper. And somehow to squeeze into that the essence of a life, of a time, and in particular of what is imminent and immanent for the person that one photographs, the future. This is the ultimate problem. Of course, it cannot be solved, but one tries.
And maybe we can look at the next image to see another example of how you achieved this. This brings us to your, we change series now. We go from the minor series to the Soweto series, and it documents actually another sort of way of existing, which is disappearing. This is the Nebele broom cellar, surrounded by the shadows of old cars, and one of your really striking images. Can you somehow tell us about your encounter with this woman and what fascinated you here?
In 1972, I spent about 6 months going in and out of the black townships of Soweto, the black townships of Johannesburg, which we know as Soweto. This was an attempt really to put down in film something of the life that was then current in this place and which very few of us knew. Millions of black people lived in the black townships, but by the nature of apartheid, we were denied the knowledge of each other's experience, the experience of each other's life. And so for about 6 months, I went in and out of Soweto. I had a 4x4 pickup with a body at the back that people could sit on or in, and a young black man from Soweto acted as my translator and mentor. And we would stop almost anywhere in this huge maze of townships, and I would say, Josh, could we please speak to that lady or this man? And here was a woman who had been selling brooms. She was from the Ndebele tribe, and I think you can see she has things around her neck and bracelets around her ankle. These were traditional. And these people came from parts of what was then the northeast Transvaal to come and sell their wares in Johannesburg. They still do today, but mostly the broom sellers are young men, and they don't come from Ndebele, they come from different parts of the country.
Yeah, there is a wonderful text your dear friend Nadine Gardiner wrote on this whole idea of an informal economy, and that's obviously something which plays also a role in your more recent photographs. We'll speak about that later, but in the next example we have here, that's another series which happened sort of parallel to Soweto or following Soweto, which is a very, very different context. We see here the widow in her flat. It's very much about memory. It's a series, I think, which is connected to a moment when you went into people's home in Hillbrow. Can you tell us how this started?
Well, while I was working in Soweto, I was also, more or less at the same time, photographing in the streets of Hillbrow, a suburb of Johannesburg. And meeting people on the streets and photographing them, I felt the need to photograph them in their homes. I wanted to become more intimate, if you like, with the context of people. And so I put an advertisement in the local newspaper, in the Star, offering to do a free portrait. I didn't want to do weddings or babies, but I would accept anybody else. And the Star printed this as offering one free pint, and a lot of people took me up on that, but anyway, this was a lady who was recently widowed, and I visited her in her apartment in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. And to me, it was, of course, very interesting and very rich, if you like, enriching of our life to be able to move from a home in Soweto to a home in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg.
And everything we've seen so far is black and white. You've used a lot of black and white photography in your work, and only much, much later, color entered. Maybe we can have the next photograph. It's actually something which you told me when we looked at your extraordinary archive in studio in Johannesburg, that somehow color only arrived in a sort of a post-apartheid situation. Color arrived with Mandela in your work.
I used color extensively in my professional work from about 1964. I worked for the London Color Supplements, and I worked for other magazines and so on. But I didn't use color in my personal work, in the essays that I did about our society. This was partly a technical thing. I didn't like color prints, and I didn't like color imagery particularly. It was very sweet and rich. But partly also it was an emotional thing. I felt that what we were doing and going through was something that had to be expressed in black and white. It was the only medium. It was a medium in which one could express fear and anger and love, I think more intensely than I could certainly in color. In post-apartheid South Africa, I felt the need to be perhaps somewhat more expansive and liberated, and began to use color quite extensively in my own personal work. The photograph that we're looking at, however, is far from being a joyous celebration. It's a photograph of blue asbestos fibers. This, if you know anything about asbestos, is the most lethal form of asbestos, highly carcinogenic. It leads to a terrible disease of the lungs called mesothelioma, which is always fatal. And this was on the top of a mine dump in the Northern Cape, and was typical of the absolute, I don't know what the word is, disrespect is much too mild a term, of the mining companies for the environment in which they mined this material, and of the people and of their disrespect for the people who mined it. They have a shocking record in the Northern Cape of South Africa, and this was a typical example. I would like just to add one brief postscript to this. A few years after I took this photograph, my wife and I drove into the same place, drove up this dump, and I did a photograph there that might be regarded as contemporary. That was some years ago, and it is beautifully covered now in felt, in grass. We, the taxpayers of South Africa, are paying for the delinquency of the mining companies. We're covering those dumps now at huge expense.
And again, the memory of that is only present through your photographs. And it continues with the next. Can we have the next image, please? Here again. That leads us more into the structures also, because when we had the interview in Johannesburg, we discussed a lot about the structure of things. And can you tell us about this?
Yeah, this is a mill on a big asbestos mine, a blue asbestos mine in the Northern Cape of South Africa. So it's a continuation of the series that I've just spoken about. This was Pomfret, a mine just south of Botswana. It closed, I think, in 1986, but typically the mining companies simply left a lot of what I can only describe as its shit on the landscape. Blue asbestos tailings lying on the ground. Children played in a shaft of this mine just behind me in water that was without question contaminated by blue asbestos.
And I was looking at the book the other day, The Structure of Things, your amazing book, and we must say the books are very important. As Helen Levitt always told me, basically photography books are at least as important as exhibitions, because you're very involved with your book, the artist books. And The Structure of Things from the late 90s has a lot to do with this idea of preservation of memories. It documents buildings and structures in South Africa that somehow are destined to disappear with time. Can you tell us more about this whole series of The Structure of Things?
Well, photographing for many years, it became clear to me that we embody in our structures very much of our values as a society. In the structure that we have here today, I've got no doubt whatever that there is a great deal embodied of the values of European and modern British society. An ingenious structure, and even in that ingenuity already are embodied a whole series of values. And so I set out quite deliberately in South Africa to look at our values as they were embodied in structures. And I use the word structures in the broadest sense to mean ethical structures, moral structures, and physical structures. And obviously, as a photographer, I photograph only what I can see in front of me or what the camera can focus on. So these were physical structures, but they embodied a great deal of our ethos. And for about 10 years, I traveled South Africa whenever I could in a camper and photographed structures of all kinds, churches, shops, houses, huts, roads, and then spent about 5 years researching and writing about these. I needed to provide a context to these photographs because I felt that people are not used to looking at structures as embodiments of values. We're used to looking at structures as expressions of architectural art and ingenuity, but we don't question what values went into them. And this is what I was particularly interested in. So in order to pinpoint some of that, I provided quite a large context in words to the structures. Even South Africans have not really thought much about their structures as embodiments of values.
The question of values plays also a role in the next series, which is the ex-offenders series. Can we have the next picture, please? The ex-offenders at the scene of the crime is obviously also connected to memory. It brings us from collective memory also to very personal memory, and actually asking people, ex-offenders, to relive episodes from their past. Can you tell us about how this started?
Well, we have a very high crime rate in South Africa. My wife and I, and virtually everybody that we know, have been victims of crime, sometimes violent, sometimes not violent, but it's endemic in modern urban society in South Africa. And I asked myself, who are the people who are doing this to us? I couldn't understand how this comes about, really. It's easy enough to explain crime by referring to poverty, to unemployment, to the ills of modern society, but somehow there needed there was for me the need to bridge the gap between the person standing in front of me with a pistol in my house and ordinary society, ordinary life. I needed somehow to bridge that. And so I set about meeting people who had committed offenses, or who were said to have committed offenses, people who had been in trouble with the law. And I didn't want to meet them. I couldn't meet them as active criminals, obviously, because they were not likely to want to meet me. Nor did I want to meet them as prisoners, as ciphers in institutions. I wanted to meet them as ordinary folk, as ordinary people, as I might meet somebody here today, or people on the street or in a supermarket. And so I set about doing that, mainly through organizations dealing with rehabilitation of prisoners. And then I wanted to make a portrait of these people, and I felt that the portrait had somehow to be connected with whatever it was that they had been accused of, or whatever they had done. And so I came to the idea that I needed to do the portrait at the scene of crime, or possibly at another scene that was of some significance in their life as it was connected with their crime. And so I evolved an approach. It consists briefly of this. Let's say that Hans Ulrich has committed a crime. He might have been involved in an armed robbery in Hamburg. And I meet him and I say, Hans Ulrich, I'm very interested in talking to you. I want to know about your life. I want to know everything that you'll tell me, please. And I'd like to do a portrait at the scene of crime. If you express fear or hesitation, I say, don't worry, I'm not going to pursue this. I don't want to put you into any kind of situation where you're in doubt about what we're going to do.
So it's a conversation. It's almost an interview.
We have a conversation,
yeah.
yes. But if you're interested in what I want to do, then I would like to take you back to the scene of crime. I then want to interview you, or I'll do the interview first. I want to know everything that you're prepared to tell me about your life. And for this, I will pay you. In South Africa, I pay 800 Rand. At the moment, I'm doing some work in England. I can't pay people here because the law prohibits ex-offenders from accepting payment for their story, but I pay whatever expenses they might have been put to. Perhaps they took a day off work. And for this, I'll ask you to sign a release that allows me to exhibit or to publish the work. And I make an undertaking that I would personally make no money at all out of this work. I make this undertaking because I wanted to be absolutely clear to Hans Ulrich that I'm not doing this in order to sensationalize his life or his story. I'm not doing this because I have some sociological interest in him. I'm interested only in what he's prepared to tell me and in the photographs that I make of him. And yeah, it's been a very interesting journey. I've been doing it now for about 4 years. I've come now to the Black Country in England, to the West Midlands, at the invitation of an organization called Multi-Story, a community organization. And yeah, I'm finding it very, very interesting. The gentleman in the photograph behind me, I took that photograph in Woodstock, in Cape Town. And he's perhaps the only person who I would describe, certainly at the time that I met him, as a monster. The question that I had when I set out on this inquiry was, are these people monsters, or are they ordinary people? Could they be me? Could they be my kids, my grandchildren? Could they be you? And on the whole, I have to answer that in the affirmative. They could be me, they could be you. But I've only met one man, and this one, Blitz. He was called Blitz because he was so quick with a knife. Blitz means lightning. He was the only one who I would say, certainly when I met him, was a monster. He might not have been a monster when he was a kid, but he became a monster from the story that I was given by his ex-girlfriend soon after he left childhood. He was murdered shortly after I took this photograph by another thug. We took this photograph at the scene where he had murdered a man with whom he had been gambling.
There's one last image of Kalula Pali, Kayeslita.
Yeah.
He's in Cape Town, another ex-offender.
This lady I photographed in an area of Cape Town called Khayelitsha. It's a black township that was started by the apartheid government in the 1980s. She came from a place called Dordrecht in the Cape, a very small town, and certainly the black people there were very poverty-stricken, largely because of unemployment. And she was the oldest of several siblings. Her father, as far as I can recall, was never a part of the house. But her mother had to go to Cape Town to seek work because there was no money in the house. And Kalulwa, this lady, at that time was the eldest of the children, and she had to feed the family, so she began to burgle shops. She was eventually caught, and I think she had a short jail term, and then went back to stealing because they had to eat. Eventually, she moved to Cape Town to join her mother. Her mother was still unemployed. Kulilwa then lived in Khayelitsha and went back to burglary. And in one of the shanty shacks nearby where she lived, in a moment of madness, I think, because nobody could get away with it in that place, she stole a television set. A child saw her, and she, in her anger, because the child said she was going to report her, attacked the child and broke its arm. The owner of the television set reported the case to the police, and she was going to be charged when Kululwa's mother interceded. She described her mother as being a very humble person, and the mother interceded with the housekeeper of that shack, the house owner, and the house owner dropped the charges, and Kululwa became respectable. She then began to use some of the money that she got from the government as a child allowance to buy, I think she bought some sweets. With the profits that she made on the sweets, she bought some chips. With the profit that she made on the chips and the sweets, she bought some beer. And so gradually she has built up a life as a small businesswoman, informal economy.
Wonderful to listen to these stories. And actually, it reminds me of something Cartier-Bresson told me when I once interviewed him, when he said that actually a photographer makes so many interviews, it's just that these conversations are not recorded verbally, they're kind of compressed in all these images. I had one last question, which is more general about memory, because when we had lunch in Johannesburg, we talked about memory in general, and I told you about the marathon, and you said that sort of not linked to specific examples, but more in general, it's a very difficult topic, because you said that somehow it's all made in the consciousness that it's about to become the past, and that the past is part of memory in photography. And you were also pointing at our lunch, and you said, you know, this lunch is going to be memory very shortly. So it's a complicated issue. Can you tell us maybe a few reflections, sort of general nature about memory at the very end?
I was fascinated this morning by the talk that we were given by the poet from Iran, because he encapsulated so much about memory that was pungent and evocative. I can't say much, perhaps because my entire life as a photographer, and that virtually fills my life, is concerned with memory, constantly and in almost every aspect, because no sooner have I made a photograph than it becomes part of the bank of memory, it becomes part of my archive, and I'm continually dealing with the archive. So I might pull out a photograph that I did 30 or 40 years ago, and it becomes now part of what I'm doing now. So it is both memory, if you like, in a condensed form, and contemporary, very contemporary, because now I look at it through eyes that are present. And there's a continuous, I don't know how to describe it, but a kind of stream of, I don't want to use the word consciousness because it's part of another discussion, but there is a stream of thoughts that continually move between the photograph that I made then and what I am now and what I see now. And very often I revise my opinion of a photograph that I did 30 years ago, because I'm no longer hassled by the conceits that might have attended the occasion when I took that photograph. I see it now quite coolly in another way. So it's a complex process, and that's why I find it actually very difficult to talk about memory.
David, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Ulrich. Thank you.